This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Good afternoon or evening, everybody. I am delighted to introduce today our speaker, Professor Anthony MacFarlane, who is from the University of Warwick. He's an emeritus professor from there, and he taught many years there in the Centre for American Studies, or the study of the Americas, or what it's called in Warwick. And he's going to speak to us today about, I think we both coincided, a great, fabulous book. I brought it in case he didn't bring it, but he did, so it's great. I'm enjoying it very much. And he will be presenting, I think, about the topics related to the book.
Yeah,
so,
yeah, thanks.
I think he needs no further introduction. I think you all know him well.
Oh, you want to use a laptop?
Do you need a laptop?
No, sure.
Sure. Okay, great. Thanks. Great.
I feel as though technological expectations have been disappointed.
No.
Well, I just wanted to talk in a rather sort of broad way about around this book, and make some sort of general observations based on the book, rather than drilling down into any of its contents, but no doubt people will ask questions that will allow me to take up some matters in greater detail than I do in this talk. So first of all, let me just say something about the book and what I was intending to do in it. I mean, I was just quite simply interested in the independence period, and had been for a long time, and in my reading on the independence period and teaching of the independence period, I was rather struck by the fact that relatively little was said, indeed by most historians, virtually nothing about the sort of military aspects, the war aspects, so to speak, of what are very frequently called the wars of independence. Having noted that the current syntheses tend to focus on the political and the social, I thought that I would look at the wars themselves and try to make some comparisons between the wars, and comment generally on their character and their conduct. Well, wars, of course, are intrinsically interesting. I mean, as all historians know, historians have made some rather large claims about the role of war in history. I mean, one thinks of the various theorists of war and the state, starting with the concept of the military revolution and its role in the genesis of the early modern state in Europe. And of course, we always have Charles Tilly's famous comment that states make war and wars make states. Well, I should say, having said that I do not enter into the debate about the legacy of the wars of independence. My book isn't concerned directly with the aftermath and the social and political legacies of the wars. But it did seem to me that one might add a bit of clarity to the assessment of the impact of the Spanish-American Wars on politics and society if we were a bit clearer about the character and conduct of the wars. So what I tried to do in the book is to create a kind of grand narrative of the wars which incorporates and compares the origins and the shapes and the development of armed conflicts in all the major theatres of war. I don't deal with everywhere. I try to deal with the major theatres of war, from Spain to Spanish America and from Mexico to the Southern Cone. And I try to show how the wars developed dynamically from the interaction of revolution and counter-revolution, insurgency and counterinsurgency. So what I'm going to do today is to just review some of the main themes and problems which I examine in the book, and to make some general comments about the context in which what we now call the Spanish-American Wars of Independence, the context in which they emerged, and their character and their conduct during the years of fighting. Well, let me just start by making a few observations about the settings in which the wars started in 1810. Perhaps the first point to make from the kind of war perspective is that wars in early 19th century Spanish America were unlike those that Spanish Americans had previously experienced. It's worth emphasizing the novelty of these wars in the sense that they involved armed conflicts of a kind and a scale which is extremely rare in Spanish America. compared with much of early modern Europe and Asia, Spanish America had long been a relatively peaceful place since the 16th century wars of conquest. War was scarce, and where it occurred, it was broadly speaking of two types: frontier wars and wars against Spain's against Spain's rivals among the European powers. Neither of these kinds of wars has any widespread impact at all. Indeed, they barely affect the bulk of Spanish America's peoples, the majority of whom live in continental interiors that are far from frontiers and far from the coasts where armed violence is most likely to occur. Foreign rivals, of course, tended to concentrate their assaults on the Caribbean islands, with occasional opportunistic offensives and raids of one kind or another along the Spanish Main. So, compared to Europe, Spanish America was a pretty peaceful place. This changes somewhat during the latter half of the 18th century. From the mid-18th century, wars in Europe tend to spread to Spanish America as British maritime power underpins occasionally ambitious amphibious operations in American waters. One thinks of Vernon in 1739-41, and of course, most successfully from the British point of view, the attack on Havana in 1762. What's more, of course, the British had willing allies among North American colonists who were keen to expand into Spanish territory and ready to participate in British wars against Spain. The most striking example is the 7 Years' War, which shifts the balance of power in the Americas, with France's loss of Canada and Spain's humiliating, if temporary, loss of Havana. Spanish ministers become anxious about British expansion, more anxious about British expansion, and more conscious of their imperial weak spots. So, as historians have long acknowledged, the defeat in the 7 Years' War is a catalyst for the important economic, fiscal and military reforms that are introduced during the reign of Charles III. Well, I'm obviously not going to go into these reforms in any but the broadest way. They're simply designed to tighten Spain's grip on its American territories by making more and better use of their economic resources through commerce, taking more from them in taxation, through fiscal changes in fiscal arrangements, and thirdly, improving their capacity for defense against external attack. So I want to say something briefly about these military reforms, since they do have some pertinence to the wars of independence. One wonders, one inevitably asks the question, what degree, to what extent do military reforms impact on the wars that take place after 1810? Well, the reforms start in Cuba in the 1760s, but they soon developed into a larger project of reorganization that's rolled out across the continental colonies during the 1770s and 80s. Behind them, the assumption that Spanish America would become increasingly exposed to international war and so had to be better prepared. So the military reforms consequently involved a couple of important innovations in the armed forces in Spanish America. Two things stand out. First, the commitment of larger military resources in the shape of regular garrisoned forces that were designed to be periodically refreshed by rotations of Spanish regiments. The second reform, possibly looking to the future of more significance, was efforts to bring about a much greater participation among the civilian population. There's also some greater investment in naval forces, but I'll leave that to one side. Well, the attention to the military reforms in Spanish America raises questions about their effects and implications. Do they bring some new kind of militarization to Spanish America? Well, it's certainly true that the latter half of the 18th century sees a very considerable enlargement of military forces and a greater reach in recruitment. Large garrisons of regular troops are present in key cities, especially the big port cities, and more effort is made to recruit Americans into regular service. More striking, though, I think, was the policy of bringing large numbers of civilians into what were called disciplined militias, extending the obligations of militia service among the male population, obligations which had long been there but which had really fallen into disuse. So in theory, at least, by the end of the 18th century, Spanish America had many more civilians who were trained and armed for war and ready to provide auxiliary forces against foreign attack. Well, thinking about the practical implications of these reforms, in the short term it seems as though they had some positive spin-off from Spain's point of view. When Spain attacks Portugal in the Rio de la Plata in 1776 and then goes to war against the British in the American War of Independence, it enjoys a really rather unusual success. Rather than being on the defensive, it goes on to the offensive, and it scores with territorial gains, and it seemed to justify the military reforms. During the same years of the early 1780s, 1780, 1781 to 82, Spain overcomes a couple of serious challenges within the colonies: the rebellion of the Comuneros in New Granada and the Great Andean Rebellion, which centered around the uprising of Tupac Amaru. Rather a greater threat than that of the Comuneros, but also contained with relative ease using forces from Peruvian garrisons. So after the American Revolution, Spain confronts foreign challenges with greater confidence. Spain, after all, at this time is the only Western power that retains its empire intact, and Charles III has no reason to fear any great change to his empire. There were some prominent figures, notably the Conde de Aranda, who feared for the stability of the American empire in the wake of the American Revolution, and as a consequence of the American Revolution. Aranda saw North American independence as a dangerous encouragement to Spanish Americans, and he suggested a preemptive reorganization of the monarchy in order to sustain Spanish rule. There wasn't, however, much traction in official circles for Aranda's opinion. The rebellions in New Granada and Peru, after all, did not become revolutions for independence, and the international situation in the 80s seems stable. The Franco-Spanish alliance is firm. Britain turns its expansionist gaze eastwards towards India. In America, it accepts the independence of the United States, and it focuses on cultivating commercial relations with the new republic. So the view from Madrid in the late 70s and late 1780s and early 1790s was thus of an empire at peace, with no immediate threats inside or out, and the prospects of more and better economic and fiscal returns. Well, what are the social and political implications of the military reforms within Spanish America? It has been argued that they brought about an Americanization of Spain's colonial forces that was eventually to rebound to Spain's disadvantage, its political disadvantage, because this Americanization nurtures officers and men, it said, who would take sides against the monarchy when it entered its period of crisis in 1808. I won't go into this here. Suffice to say that though the civic militarism of the 18th century did not bring a much greater degree of militarization, it did create resources for war which could be turned against Spain when political circumstances changed after 1808. Nevertheless, when foreign threats to Spanish sovereignty in the Americas revived in the later 1790s, in the train of revolution in France, Spanish colonial defences stood very firm. There are some signs of an internal threat, conspiracies uncovered in several cities, and the British certainly, some of British statesmen and politicians managed to persuade themselves that Spanish Americans would rise against Spanish rule if only they were given a bit of a prod, the opportunity. Hence Miranda's expedition to Venezuela and the British expeditions to Buenos Aires in 1707-8. So there is some cause to worry, but in reality the political challenge is pretty marginal. Only a very small minority of Creoles conceived of Republican ideas as serious political alternatives with any immediate future. And British-backed attempts to subvert Spanish America showed that loyalty to Spain and rejection of foreign interference outweighed any such opposition. Well, this brings me to another big point, which is that, of course, the Spanish-American Wars don't begin as wars of independence, in which people are mobilized to remove rule by a foreign regime or a colonial power. Like the Peninsular War in Spain, well, in the Iberian Peninsula, it involves Portugal too. Like the Peninsular War, the Spanish-American War are offshoots of an international war which sparks civil wars within the monarchy. Ideas about republicanism and independence become plausible political models only after the Spanish regime had collapsed under external pressures caused by international war and brought into the Iberian Peninsula by Napoleon's invasion first of Portugal and then of Spain in 1807-8. There are many differences, of course, between wars on the opposite side of the Spanish Atlantic. Wars in Spanish America may begin with wars in Spain, but if we consider the character of the Peninsular War, there are lots of differences. It starts with a foreign invasion, of course, a foreign military invasion and the usurpation of the dynasty. Once the Spanish central junta had accepted the need for direct British involvement, it then becomes a war between competing international powers on Spanish soil. The population divides between a small afrancesado minority ready to accept the new dynasty and a majority who reject the occupying forces. The latter, led by regional juntas, directed their rebellion and military action against the French. But there were also other elements to the war in the peninsula in which Spaniards fought against Spaniards. Local factions sought to take power or settle old accounts, and peasants as well as townsfolk arose against those whom they believed were their oppressors. So the breakdown of the Spanish Ancien regime brings very considerable turmoil in its wake, spreading fear among the property classes and hindering the formation of a unified movement against the French. Nonetheless, rudiments of a national army are created in 1808 and are indeed successful initially. And by 1810, the conduct of war in Spain is brought under a central command. And eventually, of course, with the joining of remnants of Spain's army to British forces, brought under the command of Wellington, or Arthur Wellesley, later to become the Duke of Wellington. The war in Spain also involves very considerable popular mobilization, including a widespread irregular war. It's here, of course, that this famous Spanish guerrilla is invented, and it is this guerrilla that's going to play a very considerable role in undermining French military power and Bonapartist political authority. Another feature of the War of the Peninsula is the social and economic impact of the war. It's tremendously, it's very considerable. The Peninsular War mobilizes tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of British and Spanish soldiers, and there are French occupying forces of up to 250,000 men, some people say even more. It involves major offensives by conventional armies fighting under British and Spanish officers, while at the same time bands of Spanish partisans fight prolonged insurgencies in the countryside. This war inflicts very heavy human and material losses. In Charles Esdale's recent history, he concludes that as many as 1 million people, about 10% of the population, may have died of famine, epidemic and massacre during the war. Well, what about the wars in Spanish America? Having said that about the wars in Spain, what are the resemblances and differences among the wars that take place in the Hispanic world? The wars in Spanish America have broadly similar origins. They stem from the same political issue, the central political issue that drove Spaniards to war against Napoleon. That is, the constitutional question of where sovereignty lie in the absence of the rightful king in the interregnum of Ferdinand VII. Spaniards resolved that question by establishing regional juntas, then convoking a central junta, then accepting the authority of a regency and a cortes. Spanish Americans also established juntas on the Spanish model at Caracas, Cartagena, Bogota, Buenos Aires, Santiago, etc. These first moves towards independence are bloodless coups which are managed by sectors of the urban elites. However, having imitated the Spanish juntistas, the Americans refused to recognize, the American juntas in general refused to recognize the new authorities in Spain. There's one or two exceptions, but they don't survive long. they refuse to accept the new authorities in Spain, and this is to lead them into war, not against France, but against the constitutional monarchy in Spain. Well, why do these wars take place? At first, there didn't seem to be much reason for their political differences to turn into armed conflict. The urban elites, which established these emergency governments in 1810, claimed legitimacy in the name of Ferdinand VII, just as the Spanish Juntistas did, and they argued that they were defending his authority and sovereignty against foreign usurpation. So rather than overturning the royal authority, they step into the shoes of the Bourbon officials and take over the existing forces and militias of the old regime. This kind of velvet revolution model failed only in Mexico. There, political dissent turns into armed conflict with a mass revolt among rural communities and provincial towns, leading to the mobilization of a huge irregular army based on peasants and plebeians who join Hidalgo's pilgrimage through the Bajío, through the countryside, looping southwards eventually onto Mexico City before retreating back to the north. Well, I'll leave the Mexican stuff aside for one moment, since it's a kind of it's an internal rebellion, a mass rebellion, and talk instead about why war spreads to South America. It's easy, I think, in hindsight, to think that this was somehow inevitable, as though the Spanish crisis was a chance for Creole patriots to express a desire for independence, which Spain was in turn bound to resist. Some people would perhaps even argue that it releases a species of nationalism, a kind of emotional attachment to a community or to communities which define themselves in opposition to Spain. Well, I think we now generally regard the latter as very unlikely, and we look for a better explanation of the starts of wars in divisions between communities, cities and regions, and in the unwillingness of the Spanish parliamentary regime, the Cortes in Cadiz, in their unwillingness to compromise. The Cortes of 1810-1814 offered Americans very considerable concessions, well, not very considerable concessions, notably in the realm of representation, but the Cortes also legitimated war against them by demanding that the juntas and their successors accept the Cortes' undivided authority. So a movement in civil war is facilitated by the position of the Cortes, which refuses to compromise with the juntas, and it's further facilitated by the fact that in America both sides have the military means to fight one another. Both royalist and breakaway governments in the leading Spanish-American cities inherit Spanish regular forces and armories, and on these bases they were able to create armies to defend and extend their political positions. Well, what's the war like in its early phases? On the whole, it doesn't unleash violence on a large scale. Plebeians and peasants, Hidalgo's rebels in Mexico, and those who followed them under various peasant caudillos, acquire a reputation for murder and plunder, and they certainly attack the people and property whom they saw as their enemies, especially the hated Gachupines. Violence is driven by anger and resentment against the wealthy, but it's more akin, I think, to common disorder and criminality than to any desire to annihilate class and ethnic enemies. Indeed, one has the impression that most of the violence during Hidalgo's rebellion was caused by counterinsurgent forces that overwhelmed the rebels in battle and hunted them down. Well, turning to South America, the early wars there involved more organized forces, and several factors constrain the scale and the spread of war. On the one hand, Spain was too preoccupied with fighting the French in the peninsula to provide much military support for its American governments, where they survived. On the other hand, another constraint on war was the fact that the juntas avoided all-out war. They tended to engage in what historians have come to call a civic war between rival towns and cities, in which forces were mobilized to intimidate enemies into surrender rather than to wipe them out. There were, of course, ominous trends in some regions, and notably Venezuela. Their contending groups quickly widen their social recruitment, and they become embroiled in a war without quarter, the so-called war to the death. Mostly, however, the efforts of the autonomous cities in South America to export revolution to their neighbours tended to be low-intensity affairs involving small forces and producing often, usually, indecisive outcomes. By 1814-15, the wars in Spanish America are winding down in the very same years that the French wars in Europe are coming to their end. Venezuela and New Granada fell to royalist armies in 1814-15. In Mexico, Morelos is captured and executed in the same years, and the insurgency that he had seemed to be knitting together falls apart, fragments into local movements. In Peru, the royalist governments have survived the assaults from Buenos Aires, eliminating their main challengers. They've put down, the Peruvian viceroy has put down rebellion in Chile and in Quito too, and they seem to be making ready in 1815-16 for an offensive, the long-promised offensive into the area controlled by Buenos Aires, an attack on Buenos Aires. Indeed, by 1816, of course, only Buenos Aires and its allied cities in what from the heights of Peru were called the lower provinces, only these places remain outside Spanish rule. And in 1816, these are under rulers who, 1815-16, under rulers, leaders who fear an imminent assault from Spain combined with an assault from Peru. So 1814-15, it looks as though the wars are going to fizzle out. But in fact, this isn't, of course, the end of war. It's merely the end of its first phase. Those who survive form enclaves of resistance that become the cradle, so to speak, of a new phase of warfare, leading to another decade of warfare that finally ends in Spain's defeat throughout continental Spanish America. Well, before turning to the character of this second phase, let's just pause to have a look at why it is that royalist governments get the upper hand by around 1815, and ask what military history tells us about the change in the balance of political power. Well, the royalist recuperation after the interregnum ended by Ferdinand's return in 1814 has several explanations. One important contemporary explanation underlined the heroism of loyalist troops. This is an explanation that was shared by both the Cortes, members of the Spanish Cortes, and the king. This was the view that the majority of Spanish Americans didn't want a break with Spain, and that the colonial rebellions had been simply that, and they'd been squashed by military means. It was possible to eliminate them by military means. There wasn't a great political threat. Fernando VII and his ministers take the same view. They assert that the movements of the breakaway movements of 1810-14 were the work of a few malcontents, Creole families who had cynically exploited Spain's moment of weakness and deceived their fellow citizens. Now, this is obviously a pretty partisan view, but we shouldn't dismiss it altogether. Some of Spain's leading opponents had a similar view, albeit in modified form. Bolivar, for example, attributed the downfall of independent governments in Venezuela and New Granada to the fact that, as he said, the mass of the population is still ignorant of its rights and unmindful of its interests. In short, he acknowledged that the royalist recovery owed something to the fact that while on the one hand a significant proportion of Americans retained a sense of loyalty to the Spanish monarchy, those who, on the other hand, were firmly committed to independence were relatively few, and lacking legitimacy had been unable to build durable independent states. He, of course, also blames patriot politicians for their lack of vision and preparedness, especially in matters of war. You know, the classic story about these men devoting attention to constitutional debates at a time when they might have been better engaged in ensuring the defeat of Spanish loyalist forces. Instead of concentrating on a common enemy, they had fought amongst themselves, and for all their protestations about freedom from tyranny, they had invariably imposed new and unwelcome burdens on their own populations. In short, one explanation of the success of Spain's counter-revolution is that its American opponents had made two fatal mistakes. They adopted political models which failed to win widespread support, and they failed to mobilize sufficient force for war. Well, there's some plausibility to this view, which I'm going to just jump over. There's an interesting comparison, I think, to be made that Bolivar makes between what he called the warlike state of the La Plata River provinces compared to New Granada and Venezuela. He sees the greater centralism of government, the more concentrated command of Buenos Aires, of being an explanation for Buenos Aires' survival when New Granada and Venezuela had both gone under. Well, there was another vital ingredient of the counter-revolution which Bolivar was unwilling openly to admit, but which was obviously crucial to the outcome of the 1810-1814 struggle, and that was the presence of, not merely the presence of a substantial number of American loyalists, but their willingness to fight for the royalist cause. Restoration of Spanish control in 1815 is accomplished by years of counter-revolutionary warfare, and most of the credit for that, for success in counter-revolutionary warfare, has to go to the officials and their supporters who persisted in fighting the rebels. Such success seems to me all the more remarkable given the inability of Spain's constitutionalist regime to project force across the Atlantic in the period of the interregnum. Not only were army reinforcements very scarce, but Spanish naval power declines very significantly. On sea as on land, Spain's American wars were, in the interregnum, left mainly to royalist officials in situ, using local men and resources with little direction or help from Spain. Americans had fought Americans, and though Bolivar was reluctant to admit it, the survival of the empire owed as much to loyalist military action as to patriot political error. Another influence on the direction and outcomes of the wars of the interregnum was the position taken by foreign powers. There's a striking contrast with the international context of previous colonial uprisings and wars of independence in the Americas. France and Spain, of course, had played a famously important part in Britain's loss of its American colonies, while the later interventions of Spain and Britain loosened France's grip on Haiti. By contrast, after 1808, the leading powers abstained from direct military intervention during the first phases of the Spanish-American Wars. France hoped to dominate Spanish America by controlling Spain. Portugal wanted to take advantage of Spain's weakness, but is restrained by its British ally. In Britain, those who wanted to promote independence in Spanish America are held back by governments which are primarily and overwhelmingly committed to defending the territorial integrity of the Spanish monarchy in order to secure the Spanish alliance against Napoleon. Even the United States, seen by some Spanish Americans as the natural ally of incipient republics, refrains from interfering, largely because of fear of the British, with whom it becomes embroiled in war in 1812. So, although the international context provides Spanish Americans with an opportunity to assert political independence, they had no powerful foreign allies to help them achieve it. Napoleon's wars in Europe monopolize political and military attention until 1815. And even though English and United States merchants benefit from trade with the independent territories of Spanish America, they provide them with very little in the way of arms or materials for war. Okay, so Fernando VII's restoration and the general revival of European monarchies after Napoleon's defeat, his final defeat, brought conditions which seem set to end the war in Spanish America as well as in Europe. The end of the Peninsular War really, fundamentally changes conditions at the core of the monarchy. Spain is no longer being bled by a continuous war on its own territory. The return of Ferdinand seems to offer greater stability. At the same time, the re-entrenchment of absolutism in Europe with a Congress system that's determined to preserve monarchy and extirpate republicanism ensures that international conditions favour Spain much more than its competitors in Europe. But the lull in warfare around the time of Ferdinand's restoration turns out to be purely temporary. By 1817, warfare in Spanish America begins to enter a new phase, moving beyond the civil warfare between groups previously subject to the same sovereign and becoming explicit wars of independence. Patriot leaders now reject Spanish rule as that of a foreign power. They want entirely separate states, and they demand international recognition as Spain's equals. Well, this renewal of wars got several explanations. In the first place, the wars of the interregnum had simply disturbed too much for there to be a return to the status quo ante-1810. The material impact of war was huge in Spain, and it hinders any simple reconstruction of the monarchy within the peninsula. As I noted earlier, Spain had been terribly affected by warfare. Indeed, Esdale asserts that for many Spaniards it had consequences that were well nigh apocalyptic. In Spanish America, the wars had been on a smaller scale in relation to their populations, but they'd also left indelible marks. They had initiated, in the first place, an unprecedented militarization of political and social life. These trends were most obvious where social grievances and social antagonisms were acute. Mexico, Hidalgo's rebellion, attracts widespread popular support because it intersected with social issues: rural distress, conflicts over land, the resentment of the castas against discrimination, the desire of indigenous communities to defend their communities against encroachment. All of these drive popular rebellion under Hidalgo and Morelos. And the militarization of Mexico by the insurgents is, of course, further amplified by the counter-revolutionary militarization directed by royalist generals who conscript village communities to fight the insurgents and install garrisons throughout the countryside. Elements of social rebellion also fuel war in South America, where civil wars among the elites provoke conflict along racial and social divides. People of the black and mulatto communities of Venezuela and New Granada fought for their own interests by joining one side or the other, sometimes switching sides. And slaves are also drawn into wars in both these regions, Venezuela and New Granada, and in the southern cone, where urban and rural slavery is also quite common. Slave participation, just a passing comment, seems at first to represent the most extreme form of social rebellion triggered by civil war in Spanish America, but in reality it's a much more complicated phenomenon. In the first place, slaves very rarely enter the wars by rebelling against their owners. There are some small slave insurrections on the Venezuelan coasts and in the mining regions of Colombia, but without great plantations, of which there were none of the slave insurrections of a kind that took place in revolutionary Haiti and Saint-Domingue. Indeed, those slaves tried to escape servitude by joining the forces of one side or the other, most are drawn into war by royalist and independentist generals who conscript them by force and who then motivate them with promises of freedom in return for a fixed period of military service. This was a practice that seems to have been started by royalist officers in the first wars, the early wars, 1810, 1814 in Venezuela. Creole politicians pretty reluctant to follow their lead because they, of course, invariably belong to that class of people who own slaves. But once the ball got rolling, once started, the recruitment of slaves into armies was bound to extend beyond the royalist armies. After 1815, soldiers, generals like Bolivar, San Martin, recognized that regular armies capable of fighting according to the tactics of modern European wars needed disciplined soldiers, and they saw slaves as potential sources of such manpower. They were, after all, a disciplined workforce. They didn't, however, encourage slave uprisings. Instead, they acquired slaves by appropriation and expropriation from their owners, starting first with Spanish owners, then moving on to others, and they incentivized the slaves with promises of freedom after their defined periods of military service. Well, the contribution made by these slaves who are liberated by conscription is difficult to assess, but there's not much doubt that they were a pretty considerable military asset on the independence side after 1815. They were particularly important, as Peter Blanchard has pointed out in his book on slaves in the Wars of Independence. They're particularly important in a social context where most men were very reluctant to commit themselves to long periods of military service or even give military service at all. Indeed, he argues that the contribution of slaves to the armies of both sides was such that without them, the wars might not have followed the trajectory that they did, nor might they have lasted so long. Well, I'm running out of time a bit, aren't I? How much longer have I got? 5-10 minutes?
We should be wrapping up, yeah.
Wrapping up. Well, I was going to say something about Indian peasants who were drawn into wars, but we can leave that for later. There, of course, been a long debate about the tendency of the Indian peasantry to seem to prefer the Spanish monarchy to its political rivalries. But, of course, Indian communities can cut both ways. If we ask in general what it is that drives plebeian participation, there's obviously no single answer. Ideological commitment sometimes plays a part. There are communities in Mexico and Peru that show an unswerving commitment to royalism. But for most of those who are drawn into warfare, it's difficult to see that royalist or republican political ideas were the main attraction. And they certainly weren't the only one. Promise of material reward, whether from plunder, the seizure of land and property, or the defence of existing landholdings, is important. So too are hopes of striking against local rivals, especially those who were white and wealthy, but also against other neighbouring peasant communities. So plebeians and peasants, in short, tend to see the wider wars through the prism of their own local interests and disputes, as local rather than national politics. I wanted to say something about the forms that popular participation in war takes, and perhaps I'll just limit myself to making a comment about the most striking kind of popular insurgency, which has a very distinct social colouring. This is that insurgency that arises from the pastoral communities of the South American plains, whose people become the exponents of guerrilla warfare of a particularly effective sort. This is a phenomenon that appears first of all in Venezuela under the royalist caudillo José Tomás Boves, who turns the llaneros of the plains into warriors for the crown and a scourge for the republic, and eventually, of course, overturns Bolivar's republic in Venezuela. After the Spanish reconquest, the same phenomenon of guerrilla warfare by these llaneros stands at the heart of the Republican revival in Venezuela. Pastoral communities also crucial to revolutionary war in the Southern Cone. On the plains of Uruguay and the neighbouring cattle countries of the Argentine littoral, gauchos, supplemented by Indians and from the missions, and led by Artigas and his caudillos. These gauchos fight guerrilla wars against outsiders. At the same time, and deep in the interior, in the area around Salta, on the borders with Peru, Güemes's gauchos hold the frontier against the royalist army of Peru. Now, this is not just politicized banditry on lawless frontiers, as one recent historian has had it. There's a strong case for seeing this as a mobilization of people who are defending local autonomy against intruders, and whose way of life as cattle herders makes them particularly able to do so. Well, other kinds of guerrilla warfare emerge in other parts of the continent, in the Andean interiors of the country, of the continent, in Peru, southern Colombia, and so on. I will jump over those. What I'd like to say, though, is that guerrilla warfare it seems to be very important, and it has been rather overlooked, because it is very definitely the bridge between the first and the second major phases of the Spanish-American wars, where independent leaders like Bolivar and his peers in Venezuela, San Martin and the others in the south, where they're able to survive defeat and evade royalist repression, they're able to continue their wars by moving wars away from moving the axes of war away from the cities and away from the clash of conventional armies. In Mexico, Venezuela, New Granada, the independents move into the backlands, and they avoid confronting their enemies in pitched battles. So too did the caudillos of Rio de la Plata. Even the militarized government of Buenos Aires, with its penchant for building armies, preferred for a few years to rely on the insurgent republiquetas of Upper Peru to harass the royalist army of Peru, while at the same time depending on the gauchos of Salta to defend against royalist invasion. So on the whole, the second phase of war in Spanish America opens with a shift towards ruralized and irregular wars, in which the independents held out against larger and better equipped royalist forces, and they did so through guerrilla warfare. And with this, of course, goes the further development of a phenomenon which, as John Lynch has shown, becomes an increasingly prominent and formative feature of politics: the caudillo or local war leader who is instrumental in mobilizing popular support and taking it to war. Well, these guerrilla wars, it seems to me, which succeed the conventional wars of the interregnum, are a vital stage in securing independence by force of arms. By keeping the war going, they puncture the Spanish colonial order at a series of very crucial points. They disrupt production and commerce, they disrupt labor systems, they undermine the networks which sustain law, administration and tax collection, thus making it much more difficult to govern. And last but not least, they sustain a series of armed enclaves in which Spain's opponents could cultivate their ambitions to create independent states and incubate the field armies that they needed to build them. Well, that leads, of course, on to a final comment, a final comment about the character and conduct of the Spanish Wars, which is the creation and role of the so-called armies of liberation at the southern and northern ends of South America. Well, the creation of these armies in the backlands of Venezuela and Argentina responds to the realization among military leaders that they couldn't rely on the allegiance and the obedience of the people in whose name they so freely spoke. They had to have regular, disciplined, permanent forces in order permanently to overcome the enemy armies, to take and hold territory, and to advance from the countryside to the cities and from one country to another. So the construction of such armies takes the wars of independence onto a new plane from about 1817. I won't go into the details. Suffice to say that the two important points at which these armies take shape are in Argentina and Mendoza, with San Martin's establishment of his Army of the Andes, with which he invades Chile to inaugurate a new war in the south, and Bolivar's formation of an army in offensive against General Murillo's forces in Venezuela. an army that's formed in the backlands of Venezuela, in the Llanos, which enables him eventually to undertake a successful invasion of New Granada. Well, these campaigns were, of course, crucial. They not only bring independence to Chile and San Martin's case, New Granada in Bolivar's case, but they also open a key stage in a new strategy for defeating royalist Peru via an amphibious assault on its Pacific coast and its capital in Lima. Well, how do we explain this turnaround in the direction of war and the shift from a Spanish restoration in 1814 to more or less total defeat a decade later? Well, it evidently owed something to the growing military effectiveness of the independence armies. They were better trained, more experienced, better led, and thanks to the growth of the international arms traffic after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, they were better armed than the early forces of the independence had been. They weren't immune from rivalries. Between Rio Platenses, Chilenos and Peruanos in San Martin's case, Neogranadinos, Venezolanos and Quiteños in Bolivar's case. But they did manage to create cohesive forces. Like their royalist counterparts, they constantly added to their number by recruitment and conscription, but this wasn't necessarily their source of strength. Conscript forces were constantly winnowed by desertion and disease. Bolivar has a nice metaphor, which is that they're like a bottomless bag. You know, the more you pour in, they just keep dropping out, and you have to constantly replace them. And they were also thought, these conscripts, to be of rather limited use militarily because of their ignorance and the difficulties of training them to fight in a disciplined way. However, the key thing about the armies of Bolivar and San Martin is that they have cores of officers and men who fought together in successive campaigns and had the benefit of the experience, training and discipline needed to stand their ground against the enemy and to engage in coordinated movements on the battlefield. Their victories also, of course, enhanced their morale and gave them momentum, winning over soldiers from the enemy's ranks. We must acknowledge, however, that throughout the wars, neither side has any decisive or lasting advantage in the technology or logistics of warfare. In all the cases that I look at, the opposing sides fight with the same kinds of weapons, same kind of forces, same kinds of firepower. When their armies meet in battle, they tend to consist of men from similar backgrounds, under officers who use conventional linear formations, with support from cavalry squads and small numbers of light cannon. They face similar logistical difficulties, shortages of money, supplies, difficulties in sustaining supply lines over long distances. All this meant that they relied mainly on resources that were extracted, often by force, from the regions in which they operated. Okay, let me turn then to the question of their political significance, and this is the point on which I will end. What is the political significances of these armies? To what extent do such armies act as vehicles for nation-making of the kind that historians find in the mass conscripted armies of 19th century Europe? Well, there's a very good discussion of this, which I rely on quite a lot in my book, by Clément Thibault in his book Republica Anonymous, in which he discusses the ways in which Bolivar's army becomes a kind of mobile republic. Bolivar needs to legitimate the republic by having elections and by creating an administration, and he does this really from within the body of his army. When he organizes elections, who are the candidates? Soldiers. Who votes for them? Fellow soldiers. When he sets up administrations, who runs them? Soldiers. So it's the Bolivarian army, really, that is the underpinning of the Colombian Republic. I think it's more difficult to make this case, and no doubt people will point this out, for San Martin's army in Peru. Though there are interesting things, it seems to me, to be said about the ways in which royalist armies hold together a kind of royalist state, and are the kind of underpinnings of loyalist political strength in various countries. Well, I'll leave that. It seems to me it's something that is obviously fruitful to talk about. I just end by saying that, of course, what one sees from looking at the wars is just how important those armies are from 1817 through to 1824-25 in securing independence. Spain is weak, but the fact is it's these armies that keep up pressure on Spain. They allow Spain no respite, and they thoroughly expose all of the problems that Spain has of projecting power across the Atlantic after the Restoration. It was hugely expensive to sustain fighting forces in America, and that becomes increasingly obvious. It's increasingly clear that Spain lacks the essential attribute, moreover, of a maritime empire. It doesn't have a navy that's capable of maintaining reliable lines of communication and supply, or of countering the destruction of Spanish trades, of Spanish commerce by the independence privateers. So, though Royalists' armies could go on fighting using local recruits, local taxes, local supplies, reliable American support begins to fall away as the independents advance and bring new territories under their control. So, while at the start of Fernando's restoration in 1814, the Royalists were fighting to extirpate Royalist Republican enclaves, by 1820, the end of his first restoration, the position was completely reversed. Spain's 1820 revolution seemed to offer the last chance to salvage something, as Spanish politicians finally acknowledged the need for a negotiated solution, but it was by now too late to salvage the empire by combining the threat of war with the promise of conciliation. And finally, Spain is drummed out of war, of Spanish America, by war. Perhaps that's a good note on which to end.
Great. Thank you so much, Tony.